The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust, the setting sun casting long shadows across the weathered buildings of Enid, Oklahoma Territory. Josephine Carter clutched her valise with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The journey from Boston had been grueling, but nothing compared to the anxiety she felt now. In just a few moments, she would meet the man she had agreed to marry, a stranger she knew only through a handful of letters exchanged over the past 6 months. The year was 1885, and at 22, Josephine had made the boldest decision of her sheltered life. After the passing of her parents and with no prospects in Boston, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed her only option. The man who had written to her, Matthew Anderson, had described himself as a hard-working cattle rancher with ambitions and a kind heart. His letters had been thoughtful and gentle, speaking of his dreams to build something lasting in this untamed territory. As Josephine stepped down from the coach, her navy traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of dust, she surveyed the main street of Enid. The town was smaller than she had imagined, with a general store, saloon, small church, and a smattering of other buildings lining the dirt road. Several curious onlookers paused to examine the new arrival. "First time in Oklahoma Territory, madam?" asked the coach driver as he handed down her trunk. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am to meet someone here, Matthew Anderson." The driver's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, Anderson, good man. His ranch is about 5 miles outside of town." He gestured vaguely westward. "Was he supposed to meet you?" "Yes, at noon." Josephine glanced at the small silver watch pinned to her bodice. It was nearly 5 o'clock. "Well, I'd be happy to take you out to his place," the driver offered, "but I don't head that way until tomorrow morning's run." Josephine felt her stomach tighten. "That's very kind, but I'm certain Mr. Anderson will arrive shortly. There must have been some misunderstanding about the time." The driver looked doubtful but tipped his hat. "Suit yourself, madam. You can wait at the hotel if you'd like." He pointed to a 2-story building across the street with a faded sign that read Enid Hotel. Gathering her courage along with her belongings, Josephine made her way to the hotel. The lobby was modest but clean, with a middle-aged woman behind the desk whose face brightened at the sight of a new guest. "Good evening," Josephine said. "I'm waiting for Matthew Anderson. He was meant to meet me when the coach arrived." Recognition flashed in the woman's eyes. "Oh. You must be his mail-order bride. I'm Martha Wilson. I own this establishment with my husband. We've been wondering when you'd arrive." "Josephine Carter," she introduced herself with a small smile. "Do you know Mr. Anderson well?" "Well enough," Martha replied, her expression warm. "He comes into town for supplies every few weeks. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's respected around these parts. Hard worker." Josephine felt a small measure of relief. "He seems to have been delayed. Would it be possible to wait here?" "Of course, dear. You can sit in our dining room." "I'll bring you some tea." Martha glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. "I'm sure he'll be along soon." Hours passed. Josephine sat by the window, watching as the town's activity gradually diminished. Martha brought her supper, a bowl of hearty stew and fresh bread, and insisted she eat despite her dwindling appetite. Night fell completely, and still no sign of Matthew Anderson. "Perhaps there's been an accident," Josephine whispered, more to herself than to Martha, who had come to check on her again. "It's not uncommon for ranchers to get held up," Martha assured her. "Weather, cattle problems, any number of things. Would you like a room for the night?" Josephine hesitated. She had very little money left after her journey, and the thought of spending it on a hotel room when she was supposed to be at her new home tonight filled her with anxiety. "I'll wait a bit longer," she decided. By 10 o'clock, the hotel had grown quiet. Most of the lamps were extinguished except for the one beside Josephine. Martha's husband had come to gently suggest she take a room, but Josephine had politely refused, her pride keeping her rooted to her chair. The grandfather clock struck 11, then 1/2 past. Josephine fought against heavy eyelids, her back aching from sitting upright for so long. Just as the clock's hands approached midnight, the hotel's front door opened with a creak. A tall man entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. His clothes were dusty, his face weathered from sun and wind. He spotted Josephine immediately and crossed the room with long strides. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice deep but hesitant. She stood, straightening her wrinkled dress. "Mr. Anderson." He nodded, a look of genuine regret crossing his face. "I'm so sorry I'm late. I was building your home." In the lamplight, Josephine could see the exhaustion etched into his features, alongside smudges of dirt and what looked like sawdust in his light brown hair. His eyes, though a clear, earnest blue, held her gaze with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite her frustration. "Building my home," she repeated, confused. "Our home," he corrected himself, the faintest flush coloring his tanned cheeks. "I've been working day and night to finish it before you arrived, but there was a problem with the roof that couldn't wait. I couldn't leave it exposed to the elements, especially with the chance of rain tonight." Josephine didn't know whether to be touched by his dedication or upset at being left waiting for so long. "You might have sent word." "You're right," he acknowledged immediately. "I should have. By the time I realized how late it had gotten, I knew the coach would have already arrived. I came as quickly as I could." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of apology and hope. "I understand if you're having second thoughts." Something in his honest admissions softened Josephine's resolve. "I traveled over 1,000 miles to be here, Mr. Anderson. It would take more than a late arrival to change my mind." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you for your understanding, and please call me Matthew." "Then you must call me Josephine." Matthew reached for her trunk. "It's late, but if you're willing, I'd like to take you home now. The house isn't perfect yet, but it's sturdy and warm." "I'd like that," she decided, gathering her valise. Matthew settled her account with Martha, who had reappeared upon hearing voices, and led Josephine outside where a wagon waited. The night air was cool, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Oklahoma sky. As he helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand steady and strong, Josephine felt a curious sensation like stepping off a precipice into the unknown, yet somehow knowing she wouldn't fall. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic hoofbeats of the horses. "I want you to know," Matthew said eventually, "that I understand this arrangement isn't conventional. I want to make it clear that while we're legally to be married, I don't expect anything from you until you're ready. You'll have your own room in the house." Josephine felt a rush of gratitude at his consideration. "Thank you, that's very gentlemanly of you." "It's only proper," he replied simply. "I hope that in time we might build something genuine between us, but I know that takes time." As they talked, Matthew explained more about his ranch, 200 acres with 50 head of cattle, a small orchard he'd planted 2 years ago, and plans for expanding once he had the means. He'd come west from Missouri 5 years earlier, determined to build something of his own. "What about your family?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "My parents passed when I was 16. I have a brother in California, but we don't keep in touch much these days." "I'm sorry," she offered. "I lost my parents as well. My father to pneumonia 2 years ago, and my mother followed just 6 months later. I think her heart simply gave out from grief." Matthew glanced at her, his expression softening. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," she admitted. "But it taught me that life doesn't always follow the path we expect. Sometimes we must forge new ones. Like coming to Oklahoma to marry a stranger." His tone held a hint of self-deprecating humor. "Exactly like that," she agreed with a small smile. After nearly an hour's journey, Matthew slowed the horses. "We're here," he said, a note of pride in his voice. In the moonlight, Josephine could make out the silhouette of a house not large but substantial. As they drew closer, she could see it was a handsome 2-story structure with a covered porch wrapping around the front. A barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely impressed. "It's not finished inside yet," Matthew cautioned as he helped her down from the wagon. "But it's livable. I've been staying in the old cabin while I built this." He gestured to a small, weathered structure about 50 yards away. Inside, the house smelled of fresh cut wood and paint. Matthew lit a lantern, revealing a large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and a staircase leading to the second floor. The furniture was sparse: a table with chairs, a settee by the fireplace, and some shelves, but everything appeared to be skillfully crafted. "Did you make all of this?" Josephine asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the table. "Most of it," he acknowledged. "My father was a carpenter before he turned to farming. He taught me a good deal." He showed her upstairs to her room, a comfortable space with a bed, dresser, and washstand. A colorful quilt covered the bed, standing out among the otherwise practical furnishings. "The quilt was my mother's," Matthew explained, noticing her interest. "I thought you might like to have it." Touched by the gesture, Josephine nodded. "It's beautiful, thank you. I'll bring up your trunk and then leave you to rest. There's water in the pitcher for washing up." He hesitated at the doorway. "I know this isn't what you're used to, coming from Boston, but I promise I'm working to make it comfortable." "Mr. Anderson Matthew," she corrected herself. "I may have lived in Boston, but I wasn't raised in luxury. This is more than I expected, truly." His smile then, small but genuine, made something warm bloom in her chest. "Good night, Josephine. We can speak more in the morning." Left alone, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day washing over her. She had come west expecting hardship and uncertainty, prepared to marry a man she didn't know out of necessity. What she hadn't expected was the care evident in the home he'd built or the consideration he'd shown for her comfort and feelings. As she unpinned her hair and prepared for bed, she gazed out the window at the vast landscape bathed in moonlight. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps this arrangement could become something more than mere practicality. Morning came with golden light streaming through the uncurtained window. For a moment, Josephine was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then memory rushed back: the journey, the wait, Matthew's midnight arrival. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, a practical blue cotton that wouldn't show dirt easily, and twisted her chestnut hair into a simple knot. The house was quiet as she descended the stairs, but the aroma of coffee filled the air. In the kitchen, she found a pot of coffee keeping warm on the stove and a note propped against a cup. Josephine had to tend to the cattle. "Help yourself to breakfast." Back mid-morning. Matthew, after a simple breakfast of bread and preserves she found in the pantry, Josephine decided to explore her new home in daylight. The main floor consisted of the large front room she'd seen last night, the kitchen, and a small study with empty bookshelves. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms: hers, Matthew's across the hall, and a smaller one at the end of the corridor. Outside, the landscape took her breath away. Rolling prairie stretched to the horizon, the tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. Behind the house, a kitchen garden had been started, with neat rows of vegetables beginning to sprout. In the distance, she could make out cattle grazing, and beyond that, the silhouette of a rider, Matthew, she presumed. She was inspecting the garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Turning, she watched as Matthew rode toward the house on a handsome chestnut gelding. In daylight, she could better see him, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-streaked light brown hair and that weathered, tanned face she'd glimpsed last night. He was handsome in a rugged way, different from the refined gentleman of Boston. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Good morning," he called, leading his horse toward her. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," she replied, suddenly aware of how informal her appearance was. In Boston, she wouldn't have greeted anyone but family without being properly dressed and coiffed. "Your home is lovely in the daylight." "Our home," he corrected gently. "I hope you'll come to think of it that way." She nodded, uncertain how to respond to the sincerity in his voice. "I need to tend to my horse," he said, "but then I thought we might talk about the wedding. The preacher comes through town every third Sunday, which is tomorrow as it happens." We could be married then, if that suits you, or we can wait until you're more settled." The directness of his proposal startled her, though of course it shouldn't have. That was, after all, why she had come. "Tomorrow would be fine," she heard herself say. "That is, if you're certain." "I'm certain," he replied, his blue eyes steady on hers. "But only if you are. I know this isn't how most people begin a marriage, and if you need more time, no," Josephine interrupted. "We made an agreement and I intend to honor it. Tomorrow is fine." Something like relief crossed his features. "I'll take care of the arrangements in town this afternoon." He gestured toward his horse. "I need to see to Jupiter here, but perhaps afterward I could show you around the property." "I'd like that," she agreed. While Matthew tended to his horse, Josephine returned to the house to freshen up. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand revealed a face she barely recognized the same features, but somehow changed by the journey and this strange new beginning. Her hazel eyes looked back at her, questioning, uncertain, yet with a spark of determination she'd inherited from her father. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "You've come too far to falter now." Matthew proved to be an attentive guide as they walked the property. He showed her the barn with its stalls for the horses and space for winter feed storage, the chicken coop he'd recently constructed, and the spring-fed well that provided their water. He spoke with quiet pride about his plans for the ranch, expanding the cattle herd, adding sheep perhaps, and extending the orchard. "The trees are still young," he explained as they walked between rows of saplings. "But in a few years, we'll have apples, pears, and cherries. I thought it might remind you a bit of back east, having fruit trees." The thoughtfulness of this gesture, planting trees years ago with the idea they might someday comfort a bride he hadn't yet met, touched Josephine deeply. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "My grandmother had an orchard in Massachusetts. Some of my happiest childhood memories are of picking fruit there in the summer." Matthew smiled, seemingly pleased by this connection. "My mother always said a home needs growing things around it to truly be alive." As the tour continued, Josephine began to appreciate the extent of Matthew's labor. Everything from the careful positioning of the house to catch breezes in summer while being sheltered from winter winds, to the thoughtful layout of the outbuildings spoke of planning and hard work. "You've accomplished so much on your own," she observed as they walked back toward the house. "Not entirely on my own," he admitted. "Neighbors help each other out here. That's how things get done in this territory. You'll meet some of them tomorrow at the church." The mention of church reminded Josephine of their impending wedding, sending a flutter of nerves through her stomach. Tomorrow, she would marry this man she'd just met. It was what she had agreed to, what she had traveled across the country for, but the reality of it was suddenly overwhelming. Matthew must have noticed her expression change. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she assured him quickly. "Just a bit overwhelmed by everything. It's all happening so fast," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, if it helps, I'm nervous too." His admission surprised her. "You are?" "Of course. I've been on my own a long time, having someone else to consider, to be responsible for. It's a big change." He paused, looking at her directly. "But I want you to know that I take this commitment seriously. I may not be the husband you dreamed of, but I'll work every day to be a good one." The simple honesty of his words moved her. "Thank you. I promise to do my part as well." They reached the house, and Matthew cleared his throat. "I need to go into town for supplies and to speak with the preacher. Would you like to come along? It might be good for you to see more of Enid." Josephine considered the offer. Part of her wanted to stay and continue exploring her new home, but she recognized the practical value of seeing the town she would be tied to. "Yes, I think that would be wise." While Matthew readied the wagon, Josephine changed into her best remaining dress, a dove gray with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her hair more carefully and added a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's. It wasn't vanity that drove these preparations, she told herself, but a desire to make a good impression in her new community. The ride to town was pleasant, with Matthew pointing out landmarks and neighboring ranches along the way. He seemed more at ease now, sharing stories about his early days in the territory and the challenges he'd faced. "The first winter was the hardest," he admitted. "I wasn't prepared for how isolated it would feel, especially during blizzards when you can't leave the cabin for days." "Is that why you decided to advertise for a wife?" Josephine asked, curious about what had prompted his decision. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he acknowledged. "The loneliness is difficult, but more than that, I realized I wanted something more than just survival. I wanted to build a life, a real home, and that's not something a man can do alone." His candor impressed her. There was no pretense about romance or passion, just a straightforward acknowledgement of human needs and practical partnership. "And why did you answer my advertisement?" he asked, turning the question back to her. "You had other options, I'm sure." Josephine considered her response carefully. "After my parents died, I found myself in an uncomfortable position. My father's cousin offered to let me stay with his family, but it was clear I would be expected to work as an unpaid governess to his 5 children. My other option was to find work as a shop girl or seamstress, but those positions barely provide enough to survive, let alone save anything." She paused. "Your letters spoke of building something, of a future. That appealed to me more than a life of perpetual servitude with no hope of advancement." Matthew nodded, seemingly satisfied with her honest answer. "Well, there will certainly be plenty of work here, but it will be building our own future, not someone else's." When they reached Enid, Josephine was struck by how different the town looked in daylight. What had seemed small and dusty the previous evening now appeared bustling and purposeful. Farmers and ranchers were in town for weekend trading, women shopped at the general store, and children played in the spaces between buildings. Their first stop was the church, a modest white clapboard building with a small steeple. Inside, they found the preacher Reverend Thomas, a kindly man in his 50s arranging hymnals for the next day's service. "Matthew Anderson," he greeted warmly. "This must be your intended. Welcome to Enid, Miss." "Carter," Josephine supplied. "Josephine Carter, Miss Carter. We're delighted to have you join our community." He looked between them with a benevolent smile. "Matthew tells me you wish to be married tomorrow after services." "If that's convenient," Matthew confirmed. Of course. Nothing brings more joy to a Sunday service than a wedding." The Reverend turned to Josephine. "And you're comfortable with this arrangement, my dear? No hesitations." Josephine appreciated his concern. "I've traveled a long way for this purpose, Reverend, I'm certain." "Very well. We'll perform the ceremony directly after the service. The congregation will be pleased to witness it." As they left the church, Matthew hesitated. "There's one more thing we need to discuss: rings. I should have mentioned it earlier." "Oh," Josephine hadn't thought about it. In her practical planning for this arrangement, such traditional symbols hadn't seemed important. "The general store keeps a small selection of jewelry," he explained. "Nothing fancy, but that would be fine," she assured him, touched that he'd considered this detail. At the general store, they were greeted enthusiastically by the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, who seemed delighted to meet Matthew's bride-to-be. "We've all been wondering when you'd arrive, Miss Carter," he said cheerfully. "Matthew's been working himself to the bone getting that house ready." As Matthew spoke with the shopkeeper about his supply order, Josephine browsed the store, taking note of what was available. The selection was limited compared to Boston shops, but all the essentials were there, along with a few modest luxuries. Mr. Jenkins showed them a small tray of rings, simple bands of gold and silver. Matthew looked to Josephine questioningly. "Which do you prefer?" She pointed to a simple gold band. "This one, I think." Matthew nodded approvingly and purchased it without question, tucking it safely into his pocket. As they continued shopping, Josephine selected a few household items, curtain material for the windows, some kitchen implements, and seeds for the garden. Matthew encouraged her choices, seeming pleased that she was taking an active interest in their home. Their last stop was the hotel to thank Martha for her kindness the previous night. The innkeeper was delighted to see Josephine looking rested and welcomed her warmly to the community. "You must come to Our Lady's social on Tuesday afternoons," Martha insisted. "It's nothing formal, just some of us gathering to sew and chat, but it's a good way to get to know folks." "Thank you, I'd like that," Josephine replied sincerely. The prospect of female companionship was appealing. She hadn't allowed herself to consider how isolated ranch life might be. On the ride home, Josephine found herself more relaxed in Matthew's company. The practical tasks of the day had given them a shared purpose, and his consideration in introducing her to people and including her in decisions had eased some of her anxieties. "Everyone seems very welcoming," she observed. "They're good people," Matthew agreed. "When I first arrived, I was as green as they come, barely knew which end of a cow was which. They could have taken advantage, but instead they taught me what I needed to know." "Is that common out here, helping strangers?" "It's necessary," he explained. "The land is unforgiving. Nobody survives completely alone. We compete sometimes, disagree often, but when it matters, we stand together." As the wagon crested a hill, their house came into view in the distance. Seeing it from this perspective, Josephine was struck again by the thoughtfulness of its placement, nestled against a small rise that would shelter it from northern winds, with a clear view southward across the prairie. "It really is beautiful," she said softly. Matthew glanced at her, then back at the house. "I'm glad you think so. When I first bought this land, I camped in different spots for weeks before deciding exactly where to build. I wanted it to be right." The care he'd taken, the deliberate choice and planning, spoke volumes about the kind of man he was: methodical, patient, with an eye toward the future. Not impulsive or romantic perhaps, but steady and dependable. In many ways, Josephine reflected, those were more valuable qualities in a husband than fleeting passion or pretty words. Back at the ranch, they unloaded their purchases and worked together to prepare a simple supper. Matthew proved surprisingly adept in the kitchen, explaining that years of bachelor living had forced him to learn the basics. "Nothing fancy," he apologized as he served a hearty stew with fresh bread, "but filling." "It's delicious," she assured him, and it was simple but well seasoned and satisfying after the long day. As they ate, they discussed practical matters for the next day: what time to leave for church, what Josephine would wear for the ceremony, who would be there. The mundane details helped normalize the extraordinary situation they found themselves in. After supper, as twilight descended, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in brilliant golds and purples. The vastness of the landscape still astonished Josephine, so different from the crowded confines of Boston. "Does it ever feel too big?" she asked. "All this open space?" Matthew considered her question. "At first it did. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but over time I've come to appreciate it. There's room to breathe here, room to grow." He looked at her. "Does it frighten you?" "No," she said, surprising herself with the realization. "It's overwhelming, but in a good way, like standing at the edge of the ocean." He smiled at her comparison. "I've never seen the ocean." "Perhaps someday we'll visit the coast together," she suggested, then felt her cheeks warm at the presumption that they would have such a future. But Matthew nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable proposition. "I'd like that. I've always wanted to see it." As darkness fell completely, they retired to their respective rooms. Alone, Josephine laid out her best dress for the morning, a cream-colored silk with lace trim that she'd saved for special occasions. It wasn't a traditional wedding gown, but it was elegant and feminine. Next to it, she placed her mother's pearl earrings and the small prayer book her grandmother had given her for confirmation. These treasured items from her past would accompany her into this new chapter of her life. Sleep was elusive that night, her mind too active with thoughts of the coming day. She found herself wondering about the man sleeping across the hall, this stranger who would be her husband in less than 24 hours. What kind of marriage would they have? Would affection grow between them with time? Would she ever feel truly at home in this wild, beautiful place? Eventually, exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts and she drifted into a dreamless sleep. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed for new beginnings. Josephine woke early, taking extra care with her appearance. She bathed using the water Matthew had left heating on the stove, dressed in her cream silk, and arranged her hair in an elegant twist, adorned with small white flowers she'd picked from the prairie the day before. When she descended the stairs, Matthew was waiting in the main room, dressed in what was clearly his finest outfit, a dark suit that, while not new, had been carefully pressed, with a crisp white shirt and string tie. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and the effect transformed him from rugged rancher to handsome gentleman. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flutter of nerves. "You look very handsome yourself." An awkward silence fell between them, the reality of what they were about to do suddenly palpable. Matthew cleared his throat. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and produced a small box. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something besides just the wedding band." Surprised, Josephine opened the box to find a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a rose. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "My mother's," he explained. "One of the few things I kept when I came west. I thought, well, I hoped you might like to wear it today." "I would be honored," she said softly. Matthew stepped behind her to fasten the necklace, his fingers brushing against her neck as he worked the clasp. The gentle touch sent an unexpected shiver through her. "There," he said, stepping back. "It suits you." The ride to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts about the momentous step they were about to take. The church was already filling with people when they arrived, and Josephine felt a momentary panic at the prospect of facing so many strangers on such an important day. "They're just curious," Matthew murmured, seeming to sense her anxiety. "Most of them are good folks who want to welcome you." Inside, they sat near the front as Reverend Thomas had requested. Throughout the service, Josephine was aware of glances and whispers directed their way, but the overall atmosphere was welcoming rather than judgmental. When the service concluded, Reverend Thomas announced that they would now witness the marriage of Matthew Anderson and Josephine Carter. A ripple of excitement passed through the congregation. Standing before the altar with Matthew beside her, Josephine felt strangely calm. This wasn't the wedding she had imagined as a young girl, but there was something honest about its simplicity. Something right about the straightforward exchange of vows between two people entering a practical partnership with open eyes. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, his voice carrying through the small church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but dignified. When Matthew slipped the gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady and warm. When they were pronounced husband and wife, and he leaned in for a chaste kiss, their first Josephine felt a spark of something unexpected, a warmth that went beyond mere courtesy. Afterward, they were surrounded by well-wishers, neighbors, and townspeople eager to meet the new Mrs. Anderson. Josephine did her best to remember names and faces, grateful for Matthew's quiet presence beside her, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. Several of the women invited her to join various social activities, quilting circles, church committees, the Ladies' Aid Society. The genuine warmth of these invitations helped ease Josephine's concerns about isolation. Martha Wilson had organized a small reception at the hotel, with cake and punch for everyone to celebrate. It was during this gathering that Josephine began to truly appreciate the community she had joined. These people had come together to welcome her, a stranger, simply because she was now connected to one of their own. "So, Mrs. Anderson," Martha said with a smile, "how are you finding our little corner of the territory?" The new name startled Josephine momentarily. "Mrs. Anderson." "It would take time to get used to that. Everyone has been very kind," she replied, "and the land is beautiful if a bit overwhelming." "You'll get used to it," Martha assured her. The first year is the hardest, but you strike me as a resilient young woman." As the afternoon progressed, Josephine found herself genuinely enjoying the company and conversation. Matthew moved easily among the guests, respected by the men and well-liked by the women, who made a point of telling Josephine how fortunate she was to have caught one of the territory's most eligible bachelors. "He's built that house with his own hands," one older woman confided. "Been working on it for 2 years now. We all wondered why, until he finally admitted he'd sent away for a bride." By the time they left town, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The wagon was loaded with wedding gifts, practical items mostly, quilts, preserves, kitchen tools, and a particularly beautiful set of china plates that the entire church had contributed to. "That went well," Matthew commented as they rode home. "They liked you." "They're very generous," Josephine replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the outpouring of community support. "It's the way things are done here," he explained. "People look after each other. You'll find yourself doing the same when the next newcomer arrives or someone falls ill." As they approached the ranch, Josephine felt a curious mixture of emotions. This morning, she had left as Josephine Carter, mail-order bride. Now she was returning as Mrs. Matthew Anderson, wife and mistress of this home. The transformation seemed both monumental and oddly anticlimactic. Matthew helped her down from the wagon with the same care and courtesy he'd shown since her arrival. "Welcome home, Mrs. Anderson," he said, with a small smile that softened his weathered features. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she replied, returning his smile. "Or should I call you Matthew now?" "Matthew, please. We are married, after all." Inside, they worked together to put away the gifts and prepare a simple wedding supper. The domesticity of these tasks helped normalize the strange situation they found themselves in, newly married, yet still virtual strangers. After they had eaten, Matthew cleared his throat. "I meant what I said before about not expecting, that is, about giving you time." He looked uncomfortable but determined. "Your room is yours for as long as you want it to be." Josephine felt her face warm. "Thank you." "I appreciate your consideration." "It's not consideration, it's respect," he said firmly. "A marriage should be built on more than just legal obligation." His words touched her deeply. In an arrangement that could have been coldly practical, he was offering her something precious: the opportunity to develop genuine feeling before physical intimacy. "I agree," she said softly, "and I thank you for understanding that." That night, retiring to her separate room, Josephine reflected on the day's events. She was married now, to a man she barely knew but was beginning to respect. It wasn't the romantic tale young girls dreamed of, but perhaps it could grow into something equally valuable: a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their new life together. Mornings began early, with Matthew tending to the cattle and horses while Josephine prepared breakfast and managed household tasks. She learned to bake bread in the wood-burning oven, to preserve fruits and vegetables from the garden, and to manage the many small emergencies that arose on a working ranch. Matthew proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to collect eggs without upsetting the hens, how to churn butter from the milk of their 2 cows, and how to identify the various herbs that grew wild on their property. He never criticized her mistakes or compared her to more experienced frontier women, instead expressing genuine appreciation for her willingness to learn. For her part, Josephine found satisfaction in these new skills. The direct connection between her labor and their well-being gave her work meaning that had been lacking in her sheltered Boston existence. When Matthew praised her first successful loaf of bread or commented on how well she'd organized their pantry, she felt a pride that surprised her. Their evenings developed a comfortable routine as well. After supper, they would often sit on the porch if the weather was fine, or by the fireplace if it was cool, talking about their days and making plans for the ranch. Matthew taught her to play checkers, and she discovered he had a competitive streak that matched her own. Sometimes, she would read aloud from one of the few books they owned, her voice filling the quiet house as Matthew listened, occasionally asking questions or offering observations. Through these simple shared moments, a companionable ease grew between them. They were learning each other's habits and preferences, developing the small accommodations that make shared living work. Matthew discovered that Josephine enjoyed wildflowers and began bringing her interesting blooms he found while riding the property. Josephine noticed that Matthew had a sweet tooth and made an effort to bake ginger cookies, which quickly became his favorite. Physically, their relationship remained proper and restrained. Matthew was unfailingly courteous, never pressuring or making inappropriate advances. He would help her down from the wagon with a gentle hand, occasionally touch her shoulder or elbow to guide her, but always with respect for her boundaries. Yet Josephine found herself increasingly aware of him as a man, noticing the strength in his hands as he repaired a fence, the way sunlight caught in his hair when he worked outdoors, the rare but warming sound of his laughter. These observations both confused and intrigued her, stirring feelings she hadn't anticipated in this practical arrangement. One evening, about a month after their wedding, they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset. The day had been unusually warm for spring, and the evening air was fragrant with prairie flowers. "I received a letter from my friend in Boston today," Josephine mentioned. "Martha had brought it when she'd come by with some cuttings from her garden. She's quite curious about my new life here." "What did you tell her?" Matthew asked, genuinely interested. Josephine smiled. "That it's nothing like Boston, but that I'm learning to appreciate its beauty and challenges. And are you, truly?" She considered the question carefully. "Yes, I think I am. It's harder work than I expected, and I miss certain comforts, but there's something real about life here that I value." Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's how I felt when I first came west. Everything in the city seemed so artificial compared to this." He gestured toward the sunset-painted prairie. "Do you ever regret it, coming here?" "No," he said without hesitation. "It's been difficult at times, lonely often, but I've never regretted the decision." He paused, then asked more cautiously, "Do you regret answering my advertisement?" Josephine took her time answering, wanting to be honest. "I don't regret it. I was afraid I might, especially that first night waiting at the hotel, but no, this has been better than I dared hope." Something shifted in Matthew's expression, a softening, a warming that made Josephine's heart beat a little faster. "I'm glad," he said simply. But the words carried weight. They sat in companionable silence as darkness descended and the first stars appeared. When a cool breeze arose, Matthew stood and offered his hand to help her up. "We should go in," he said. "It's getting chilly." His hand remained around hers a moment longer than necessary, a small intimacy that felt significant. That night, as Josephine prepared for bed, she found herself wondering what it might be like to truly be Matthew's wife in all ways. The thought brought a blush to her cheeks, but also a curious anticipation. As spring gave way to early summer, the work on the ranch intensified. The vegetable garden required constant attention. Cattle needed moving to fresh grazing, and preparations for haying later in the summer had to be made. Josephine found herself stronger and more capable with each passing week, her city pallor replaced by healthy color from working outdoors. Matthew had begun teaching her to ride properly, an essential skill for ranch life. Her first attempts on the gentle mare he'd purchased for her were awkward and slightly terrifying, but his steady guidance helped her overcome her initial fears. "You're a natural," he encouraged after she successfully navigated a small circuit of the property alone. "By summer's end, you'll be riding as well as any woman in the territory." "I doubt that," she laughed, dismounting with his assistance, "but I'm enjoying it more than I expected." Their hands met as he helped her down, and for a moment they stood close together, the mare grazing contentedly beside them. Something in Matthew's eyes made Josephine's breath catch a warmth, an admiration that went beyond mere approval of her riding progress. Josephine, he began, his voice lower than usual, but was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. Turning, they saw two men approaching on horseback. Matthew's expression shifted immediately to alertness, his hand moving unconsciously to the rifle in its scabbard on his saddle. "Are you expecting visitors?" Josephine asked, suddenly aware of how isolated their ranch was. "No," Matthew replied, his tone cautious. "But I recognize Ben Walker's bay. That's him and his son Timothy, I think." As the riders drew closer, Matthew relaxed slightly. "The Walkers have the next ranch over, about 5 miles east. Good people." Ben Walker was a weathered man in his 50s with a friendly smile beneath his graying mustache. His son appeared to be in his early 20s, with a similar open face and easy manner. "Matthew." Ben called as they approached. "Hope we're not intruding. We were checking our western fence line and thought we'd pay our respects to your bride." "Not intruding at all," Matthew assured them, helping Josephine back onto her mare for the short ride to the house. "We were just heading back for some refreshments. You're welcome to join us." At the house, Josephine busied herself preparing coffee and setting out the apple pie she'd baked that morning while the men talked on the porch. When she joined them with the refreshments, Ben Walker stood politely. "Mrs. Anderson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. We were sorry to miss the wedding, but we had some calving troubles that kept us away." "Please call me Josephine," she replied, serving the pie, "and it's lovely to meet you both." The conversation flowed easily, with Ben sharing news from other neighboring ranches and discussing the prospects for summer rainfall. Timothy, quieter than his father, nevertheless contributed observations about cattle prices and a new strain of wheat some farmers were trying. "Your home is beautiful," Ben commented, looking around appreciatively. "Matthew's been working on it for quite some time. We were all curious what was driving him to build such a fine house." Matthew looked slightly embarrassed. "I wanted it to be right," he said simply. "Well, it certainly is that," Ben agreed. "A proper home for a family." The word family hung in the air, causing a moment of awkward silence that Josephine hurried to fill by offering more coffee. As she poured, she caught Matthew watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. After the Walkers departed, promising to have the Andersons over for supper soon, Josephine and Matthew returned to their evening routine, though something felt different. The mention of family had introduced a new awareness between them, a reminder of expectations neither had discussed directly. That night, as they sat by the fire, Matthew seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at Josephine when he thought she wouldn't notice. "Is something troubling you?" she finally asked. He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Ben's comment about family, I hope it didn't make you uncomfortable." "No," she assured him. "It's a natural assumption that a married couple would want children eventually." "Yes, eventually," he agreed, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the fire. "But only when if we're both ready for that step." The consideration in his words touched her deeply. "Thank you for that," she said softly, "for never pressuring me." "Josephine," he began, then seemed to reconsider what he'd been about to say. "I want you to be happy here. That's important to me." "I am happy," she replied, and realized with some surprise that it was true. Despite the hard work, despite the isolation, despite the unconventional beginning to their marriage, she had found contentment in this new life, and much of that was due to the man sitting across from her. The look that passed between them, then, was charged with unspoken feeling, a current of connection that had been gradually building over the weeks of shared life. When Josephine finally excused herself to retire for the night, her heart was beating faster than usual, her thoughts in pleasant disarray. Summer arrived in earnest, bringing longer days filled with constant work. The vegetable garden flourished under Josephine's care, providing fresh produce for their table. She mastered the art of canning, preparing for the winter months ahead with rows of preserved beans, tomatoes, and corn lining the pantry shelves. Matthew spent long days in the fields, cutting and baling hay for winter feed. Often he would return home sun-burned and exhausted, grateful for the cool water Josephine had drawn from the well and the hearty meals she prepared. Despite the exhaustion, these were happy days. They worked as partners, each contributing to their shared life in meaningful ways. The rhythm of rural existence suited Josephine better than she could have imagined, the direct connection between labor and results satisfying something in her that city life had left unfulfilled. In late June, they were invited to a barn raising and community gathering at the Thompsons' farm, about 10 miles away. Such events were important social occasions in the scattered community, and Josephine looked forward to the opportunity to see the neighbors she'd met and meet those she hadn't. The day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the gathering. Josephine wore her second-best dress, a blue cotton with white trim that she'd altered to better fit her now slightly leaner frame. Matthew, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, looked handsome and somehow younger away from the daily concerns of the ranch. The barn raising was already underway when they arrived, men working in well-coordinated teams to raise the massive timbers while women prepared food at tables set up in the shade. Children ran playing between the wagons and horses, their laughter carrying across the farmyard. Josephine. "Welcome," called Sarah Thompson, a friendly woman in her 40s who Josephine had met at church. "The men are over there if you want to help, Matthew. Josephine, we could use another hand with the biscuits if you're willing." They separated to their respective tasks, Matthew joining a group of men preparing to raise another section of wall while Josephine found her place among the women at the cooking tables. She was welcomed warmly, included immediately in conversations about crops, children, and the latest news from town. "So, how are you settling in at Matthew's place?" asked Emma Davis, a young wife from a neighboring homestead. "Quite well," Josephine replied, cutting biscuit dough with practiced movements. "The garden is thriving and I'm learning more every day about ranch life." "Matthew seems different since you arrived," observed Clara Wilson, Martha's sister-in-law. "Happier, less solitary. Does he?" Josephine couldn't help the pleased feeling that rose in her chest at this observation. Clara nodded decisively. "Absolutely. He was always respected, but he kept to himself too much. Now he talks more, participates more. It's good to see." Throughout the day, Josephine noticed what Clara had described. Matthew moved easily among the other men, joining in jokes, offering suggestions, working seamlessly as part of the team. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the busy farmyard, and he would offer a small smile that felt like a private communication amid the crowd. When the main structure of the barn was complete, a cheer went up from the workers, and tables were quickly arranged for the feast that followed. Josephine found herself seated beside Matthew, their shoulders occasionally touching as they enjoyed the abundant food. "You seem to be having a good time," he commented, passing her a plate of fried chicken. "I am," she agreed. "Everyone has been so welcoming, and you." "You seem to be enjoying yourself as well." He nodded, a relaxed smile softening his features. "It's good to work together on something like this. Reminds us all why we chose to settle in such a challenging place." After the meal, instruments appeared: a fiddle, banjo, harmonica, and guitar, and the cleared space before the new barn became an impromptu dance floor. Lively tunes filled the air and couples began to dance, from gray-haired elders to youngsters just learning the steps. "Would you like to dance?" Matthew asked, surprising Josephine with the invitation. "I'd love to," she replied, equally surprised at how much she meant it. Matthew was no expert dancer, but he moved with the natural grace of a man comfortable in his body. His hand at her waist was warm and steady as they joined the other couples in a lively reel. Josephine, who had learned the formal dances of Boston society, quickly adapted to the more free-spirited frontier style. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the music slowed. When a waltz began, Matthew drew her closer, his eyes questioning. Josephine stepped willingly into his embrace, her hand resting on his shoulder as they moved together in the ancient three-step pattern. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, his voice lower than usual. So do you, she replied, aware of the heat of his palm against her back, the slight roughness of his hand holding hers. I've never much cared for dancing before, he admitted, but with you it's different. The simple words, spoken softly for her ears alone, sent a warm flutter through Josephine's chest. As they continued to dance, the space between them seemed to diminish, their bodies moving in increasingly harmonious unity. When the music ended, they remained standing close together for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Around them, other couples were breaking apart, moving toward the refreshment tables or sitting to rest, but Josephine felt reluctant to step away from the circle of Matthew's arms. It was Matthew who finally took a small step back, though he kept her hand in his. "Would you like some punch?" he asked, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Yes, please," she replied, suddenly aware of how warm she felt despite the cooling evening air. As they sipped punch at the edge of the gathering, Josephine noticed several approving glances directed their way. It occurred to her that they were being observed as a couple, evaluated by the community that had welcomed them individually. "I think we're passing inspection," Matthew commented quietly, apparently noticing the same looks. Josephine laughed softly. "Is that important, out here? Yes, community matters." He looked at her with sudden seriousness. "But what matters more is what you think." "Are you happy with our arrangement, Josephine? Truly?" The directness of the question took her by surprise, but she appreciated his honesty. "Yes," she said simply. "More than I expected to be." Something in his expression shifted, a tension releasing. "I'm glad I've been concerned that you might find this life too difficult, too isolated." "It is difficult," she acknowledged, "and sometimes lonely, but it's also rewarding in ways I never imagined." She paused, gathering courage. "And you make it less lonely." His eyes held hers, something warm and hopeful in their blue depths. "You do the same for me." The ride home that night was quiet but charged with unspoken possibility. The stars spread across the vast prairie sky, brilliant in their multitude, and a nearly full moon illuminated the landscape in silver light. At the ranch, Matthew helped Josephine down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Standing close together in the moonlight, Josephine felt a decision approaching, a threshold about to be crossed. "Josephine," Matthew began, his voice low and earnest. "I know our marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I want you to know that for me, it's become much more than that." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've grown to care for you deeply, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Her heart quickened at his declaration. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "These past weeks have changed everything I expected from this arrangement." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Matthew raised his hand to her cheek. His fingers were slightly calloused from work but infinitely gentle against her skin. "May I kiss you? Not as a formality like at our wedding, but as a husband who desires his wife." "Yes," she whispered, her eyes meeting his in the moonlight. His lips met hers with tender restraint that quickly deepened into something more passionate as Josephine responded, her hands moving to his shoulders, then sliding around his neck. The kiss awakened sensations she had never experienced, a warmth that spread through her body and made her press closer to him. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" She asked, curious rather than accusatory. "I wanted to be sure you were happy here first, happy with me. I didn't want you to feel obligated." The consideration behind his restraint touched her deeply. This was a man who had put her comfort and happiness before his own desires, who had given her time and space to develop genuine feelings rather than demanding his husbandly rights. "I am happy," she assured him, her hands still resting on his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "And I'm ready to truly be your wife, Matthew, in all ways." The look that passed between them then was one of mutual understanding and desire. When Matthew offered his hand to lead her inside, Josephine took it without hesitation, stepping willingly into this new phase of their shared life. That night transformed their marriage from a practical partnership into a true union of hearts and bodies. Matthew proved to be as considerate and attentive in intimacy as he had been in all other aspects of their relationship, guiding Josephine with gentle patience through this new territory. In the quiet aftermath, lying in what was now their shared bedroom, Josephine rested her head on Matthew's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, a casual intimacy that felt both new and somehow familiar. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, concerned for her comfort even now. "More than all right," she assured him, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "I'm happy, Matthew, truly happy." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, warm, brilliant, full of promise. "So am I," he said simply, drawing her closer. "More than I ever thought possible." As summer progressed into its fullest expression, Josephine and Matthew's relationship deepened and blossomed like the wildflowers that carpeted the prairie. The physical dimension of their marriage brought a new closeness, a shared intimacy that strengthened the bond already forming between them. Their days continued to be filled with work: hay to harvest, vegetables to preserve, preparations for the coming winter, but now there was a sweeter anticipation to the evenings spent together. They still talked and played checkers and read aloud, but these activities were now interspersed with tender kisses and affectionate touches that often led them to retire early to their shared bedroom. In early August, they received an invitation to dinner at the Walker Ranch. Josephine had met Ben Walker and his son Timothy during their visit in June, and looked forward to seeing their home and meeting Ben's wife, Clara, who had been too ill to attend the barn raising. The Walker Ranch was larger than theirs, with a sprawling main house that spoke of years of prosperity and expansion. Clara Walker, a small woman with bright eyes and a ready smile despite her frail appearance, welcomed them warmly. "I've been so looking forward to meeting you, Josephine," she said, taking Josephine's hands in her own. "Ben and Timothy have told me all about Matthew's Boston bride." "All good things, I hope," Josephine replied with a smile. "The very best," Clara assured her. "Now come, help me in the kitchen while the men talk cattle prices, which I find terribly dull." In the kitchen, as they put finishing touches on the meal, Clara proved to be a delightful conversationalist, sharing stories of her 30 years in the territory with humor and insight. Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months. "It does my heart good to see Matthew so happy," Clara commented as they arranged biscuits in a basket. "He's carried a burden of loneliness for too long. Has he always been so reserved?" Josephine asked, curious about her husband's past. Clara considered the question. "Not always. When he first came west, he was more open, more eager, but life here can be hard and he's faced his share of setbacks. The drought 2 years ago nearly broke him. He lost almost half his herd." She paused, looking at Josephine with kind eyes. "But since you've come, there's a lightness to him again." Ben noticed it right away. The thought that she had brought such positive change to Matthew's life filled Josephine with quiet joy. During dinner, she observed her husband with new awareness, noticing how he had indeed become more animated, more engaged with others than the reserved man who had met her at the hotel that first night. He laughed at Ben's stories, discussed farming innovations with Timothy, and frequently included Josephine in the conversation with a warmth that made it clear how much he valued her opinions. On the ride home, under a canopy of stars, Josephine shared Clara's observations. "She said you seem happier now, that you were more closed off before I came." Matthew was quiet for a moment, considering. "She's right," he finally acknowledged. "The last few years were difficult. I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake coming west, if I was meant to face it all alone." He glanced at her, his expression softened by moonlight. "Then your first letter arrived and something changed. I had a purpose again, something to work toward. Building our home," she said softly. "Yes, and now with you here it truly is a home." He reached across the wagon seat to take her hand. "I never expected to find what we have, Josephine. I hoped for a companion, a partner in building this ranch. I never dared hope for love." The word hung in the night air between them, spoken for the first time. Josephine's heart swelled with emotion. "Is that what this is?" "Love," Matthew nodded, his eyes steady on hers. "For me, yes, I love you, Josephine. I think I began falling in love with you that first night when you waited so patiently at the hotel and didn't give up on me." "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling right and true on her lips. "It grew so gradually I hardly noticed until it was already there, filling all the spaces between us." When they reached home, Matthew lifted her from the wagon and carried her inside, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. That night, their lovemaking held a new depth, a celebration of the feelings they had acknowledged and the future they were building together. As summer began its gradual transition to fall, life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm, though now colored by the deeper connection between them. They worked as true partners, making decisions together about the ranch's future, planning improvements to the house, discussing the possibility of expanding their herd when spring came. One cool September morning, Josephine woke feeling unusually tired and slightly queasy. She dismissed it as nothing significant and went about her morning chores, though with less energy than usual. When the same symptoms persisted for several days, accompanied by a strange sensitivity to certain smells, a suspicion began to form. She kept her thoughts to herself at first, counting days and watching for other signs, before allowing herself to believe what seemed increasingly likely. It wasn't until the end of the month, when she was certain she had missed her monthly cycle entirely, that she decided to share her suspicions with Matthew. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Josephine gathered her courage. "Matthew, I have something to tell you." He looked up from the harness he was repairing, alerted by something in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right," she said, a smile blooming despite her nervousness. "I believe, that is, I'm quite certain that we're going to have a child." Matthew's expression transformed from concern to wonder in an instant. "A child? Are you sure?" She nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "As sure as I can be. It would be sometime in late spring, I think." Setting aside the harness, Matthew crossed to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Josephine, this is wonderful news," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A child, our child. You're happy then?" Happy doesn't begin to describe it. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then looked up with sudden concern. "But you, how are you feeling? Is there anything you need?" His immediate concern for her welfare touched Josephine deeply. "I'm a little tired and queasy in the mornings, but otherwise well." "It's all perfectly normal from what I understand." "We should ride into town soon, speak with the doctor," Matthew suggested, "and I'll need to make a cradle, and we should prepare the small bedroom for a nursery." And Josephine laughed, charmed by his enthusiasm. "We have months yet, Matthew." "Though I do like the idea of a cradle made by your hands." He smiled, a look of tender determination settling on his features. "Our child will have the best I can provide. I promise you that." The following months brought changes to their household as they prepared for the new arrival. Matthew began work on a cradle, carefully selecting the finest wood and working on it in the evenings by the fire. Josephine sewed tiny garments and blankets, sometimes joined by neighboring women who brought gifts and advice. As winter settled over the prairie, bringing snow and bitter winds, Josephine's body changed, her belly gradually rounding with new life. Matthew treated her with increased tenderness, insisting she rest more and taking on additional household duties despite her protests that she was perfectly capable. "You're carrying our future," he said simply when she objected to his fussing. "Let me do this for you, for both of you." The depth of his love, expressed in these daily acts of care and consideration, continually amazed Josephine. This was a man who had once advertised for a wife out of practical necessity, yet now showed a capacity for devotion that went far beyond mere duty. Christmas came, bringing with it a festive spirit despite their isolation. They exchanged simple gifts: a hand-knitted scarf from Josephine for Matthew, and from him to her, a rocking chair he had secretly built in the barn during the coldest days when outdoor work was impossible. "For you to rock our baby," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth wooden arms, tears of appreciation in her eyes. As winter slowly gave way to spring, they received word of a tragedy in the community. The Thompson family, whose barn raising they had attended the previous summer, had lost their home to fire. Everyone had escaped safely, but the house and most of their possessions were destroyed. "We need to help them," Josephine said immediately upon hearing the news from Ben Walker, who had ridden over to inform them. "They have 3 young children." Matthew nodded in agreement. "We'll do whatever we can. Is there a plan in place yet?" "The men are gathering to build them a temporary shelter until a proper house can be constructed," Ben explained. "The women are collecting household goods, clothing, whatever can be spared." Despite her advancing pregnancy, now in its 6th month, Josephine insisted on contributing. She gathered linens, kitchenware, preserved food from their pantry, and even some of the baby clothes she had made, knowing that the Thompsons' youngest was still small enough to use them. Matthew joined the men in building the shelter, returning home late for several days, exhausted but satisfied with the community's response to the crisis. "This is why we settle in such challenging places," he told Josephine, "because when difficulty strikes, no one faces it alone." The experience strengthened their connection to the community and reinforced for Josephine the value of the life. They were building not just a successful ranch or a comfortable home, but meaningful relationships with neighbors who understood the importance of standing together. As spring advanced and the prairie came alive with new growth, Josephine's time grew near. Dr. Wilson from town came to check on her, pronounced her healthy and the baby well-positioned, and advised her to rest as much as possible in these final weeks. "Not that ranch wives ever listen to that advice," he added with a knowing smile. "But do try to take it easy, Mrs. Anderson. First babies sometimes come early, sometimes late, but they all come in their own time." Matthew became increasingly anxious as the expected date approached, making sure everything was prepared and often checking on Josephine throughout the day. The cradle stood ready in the nursery, lined with soft blankets. The rocking chair had been moved upstairs, positioned near the window where the morning light would be gentle. "You've thought of everything," Josephine assured him one evening as he fretted about whether they had enough clean cloths prepared. "I want it to be perfect for you," he admitted. "This is all new to me, and I'm afraid of failing you when you need me most." She took his hand, placing it on her rounded belly where their child was particularly active that evening. "Feel that. That's our baby, strong and healthy. You haven't failed us, Matthew. You've given us a home, security, and love. That's everything we need." His expression softened as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "I never imagined I could love someone I haven't even met yet," he marveled. "But I do, almost as much as I love their mother." The baby arrived on a perfect May morning, after a long night that tested Josephine's strength and Matthew's nerves. Martha Wilson and Clara Walker had come to assist, bringing their experience and calm presence to the birthing room while Matthew paced anxiously downstairs. When the first cry pierced the early morning quiet, Matthew froze mid-stride, his heart seeming to stop for a moment before racing ahead. The wait that followed, as the women cleaned and checked the baby and tended to Josephine, was the longest of his life. Finally, Martha appeared at the top of the stairs. "Congratulations, Matthew, you have a son, a strong, healthy boy, and Josephine is doing well, just tired." Matthew took the stairs 2 at a time, entering the bedroom with a mixture of eagerness and reverence. Josephine lay against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. When she looked up and saw him, her smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Matthew, come meet your son," she said softly. He approached the bed carefully, almost afraid to disturb the perfect tableau before him. When Josephine pulled back the blanket slightly to reveal a tiny face with a tuft of dark hair, Matthew felt his heart expand with a love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching one tiny fist that immediately curled around his finger with surprising strength. "Just like his mother. Would you like to hold him?" With careful instruction from Clara, Matthew took his son in his arms for the first time, marveling at how small and yet complete he was, from the delicate eyelashes to the perfectly formed fingernails. "What shall we call him?" Josephine asked, watching her husband and son with tired contentment. Matthew thought for a moment. "What about William, after your father?" Tears welled in Josephine's eyes at the thoughtful suggestion. "William Anderson, it's perfect." The women discreetly left the new family alone for a time, returning later to help Josephine wash and to ensure both mother and baby were comfortable. Matthew reluctantly left to tend to essential chores, but returned quickly, unable to stay away from his wife and newborn son for long. That evening, as twilight settled over the prairie, Matthew sat in a chair beside the bed where Josephine rested with William sleeping peacefully beside her. "I never imagined this," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "When I sent that advertisement east, I hoped for a companion, someone to share the work and the isolation. I never dared dream of such happiness." Josephine reached for his hand, her eyes filled with love. "Nor did I when I decided to become a mail-order bride. I was seeking security, a chance at independence from relatives who saw me as a burden. Instead, I found a home, a husband I loved deeply, and now this precious child." She looked down at William's sleeping face. "Life takes unexpected turns, doesn't it?" "The best kind of turns," Matthew agreed, leaning forward to place a gentle kiss on her forehead, then another feather light on his son's head. "Thank you for waiting for me that night, for giving me a chance to explain about the house." "Thank you for building it," she replied with a smile. "For making a home for us before you even knew me." In the peaceful quiet of the evening, with their newborn son sleeping between them and the future stretching out with possibility, Josephine and Matthew shared a look of perfect understanding, two people who had begun as strangers bound by practicality, now united by the deepest love, and the family they had created together. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through new spring grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, wild sounds of the territory that had brought them together, and now cradled their growing family in its vast embrace. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to the Anderson family. William grew into a strong, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. When he was 2, a sister joined the family, little Emma, named after Matthew's mother, with a headstrong personality that kept them all on their toes. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Matthew's cattle herd expanded, and Josephine's garden became known throughout the area for its productivity. They added sheep to their livestock, the wool providing additional income when sold to eastern markets. The house that Matthew had built with such care became truly a home, filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, and occasionally the company of neighbors and friends who traveled miles across the prairie to share a meal and conversation. On the 5th anniversary of Josephine's arrival in Oklahoma Territory, they sat together on the porch swing Matthew had built the previous summer, watching William and Emma play in the yard as the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple. "You ever think about that first night?" Matthew asked, his arm comfortably around Josephine's shoulders. "When you waited until midnight at the hotel," she smiled at the memory that had once been frustrating but now held a special place in their story. "Sometimes. I remember how exhausted and uncertain I felt, and then how that changed when you explained you were late because you were building our home. I was terrified you'd take one look at me and decide to return east on the next coach," he admitted with a chuckle. "Never," she assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. Even then, something told me I was exactly where I belonged. Matthew's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining in the easy familiarity of long-established love. When I think of how differently things might have gone if you hadn't waited, if you'd given up on me. But I did wait, she reminded him gently, and look what we've built together, so much more than just a house or a ranch. As twilight deepened into night, they called the children in for supper, the four of them gathering around the table Matthew had crafted in those early days. The simple domestic scene, father, mother, son, and daughter sharing food and conversation, held a beauty that neither Josephine nor Matthew took for granted. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, they returned to the porch to enjoy the cool evening air and the spectacular canopy of stars that still amazed Josephine after all these years. "I have something for you," Matthew said, reaching into his pocket. "A small token for our anniversary." He placed a small wooden box in her hand. Opening it, Josephine found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Inside were tiny portraits, Matthew on one side, the children on the other, painted by a traveling artist who had passed through Enid the previous month. "Matthew, it's beautiful," she breathed, immediately removing the silver rose pendant she still wore daily and replacing it with this new treasure. "I wanted you to be able to keep us close to your heart, even when we're apart," he explained, helping her fasten the clasp. "I always do, with or without a locket," she assured him, turning in his arms to offer a kiss of thanks that quickly deepened into something more passionate. When they eventually parted, Matthew's eyes held that familiar warmth that never failed to quicken Josephine's pulse, even after years of marriage. "Shall we go inside, Mrs. Anderson?" he suggested with a smile that spoke of private intimacies. "Indeed we shall, Mr. Anderson," she agreed, taking his hand as they rose from the swing. Inside their home, the home he had built with his own hands, where their children slept peacefully, and their future stretched out with continued promise, Josephine and Matthew reaffirmed the love that had grown from practical arrangement to passionate commitment, from cautious hope to absolute certainty. What had begun with a mail-order bride waiting anxiously until midnight, and a late-arriving cowboy who had been building her home, had transformed into something neither could have anticipated but both now treasured beyond measure: a true partnership, a family bound by love, and a shared life rich with purpose and meaning in the vast, beautiful wilderness of the Oklahoma Territory.